That's all good. Thanks, Christian.
So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Firstly, as well, to our Welsh colleagues, Dydd Gwyl Dwi Hapus. Happy seeing Dave's Day, everyone. Spring is almost around the corner. What I will do over the 15 minutes is just talk about how we approached it at the University of Southampton, the assessment of performance component of the APP, which I've sort of led on our behalf. And we'll touch briefly just at the end on the target setting, how we were able to create meaningful and appropriate targets for each of our intervention strategies. So we'll talk about the timeline, the sort of the needs and the expectations that we had going through it. Wave one was a bit more compressed. It was definitely a sprint more than a marathon. We'll talk about the assessment of performance potential versus the actuality, because obviously we all have our own constraints, whether those be the actual FTE, the actual hardware, the software we're using, etc. I'll talk about the data sources which we've used at Southampton to generate our assessment of performance, talk about some of those themes which the Office for Students love to see in this work, so statistical uncertainty, etc. We'll talk about the finished product, and then we'll just talk about target setting. And just to highlight that, I'm not going to go into much detail about specific targets or detailed accounts of the outcomes, just the dry process of how we got to where we were. So hopefully there'll be snippets that you can then take on to develop your own assessment of performances. So I needn't show this diagram. It's probably etched into your brains. You're probably all dreaming about it, but we all know that the assessment of performance, the sort of the crux of the APP, is to identify those most pressing populations at risk and about promoting greater equality of opportunity. Sounds easy when you read just the one or two sentences, but actually trying to delve into this with all of that data and to build the narrative, it can be quite difficult. Going through into wave one, I'm sure we'll hear this from the other speakers today, we were in an evolving space. We had our M1 and RA6, which was still in review. We were getting guidance every other week, or trying to get more guidance every other week. As a team, when we devised the previous iteration of the APP, we had significant more FTE involved in the process. So we had individuals focusing on specific populations, specific student outcomes. This time it was just myself, really. But that's just due to the sort of constraints and needs of the university more generally. One of the biggest challenges you'll all probably have is trying to manage the size of the data that you can use in this. Remember, you've got 5 student life cycle stages, you've got 6 years of APP in some areas, you've got all the student characteristics you can throw at it, splits, numerators, denominators, year-on-year change, long-term change, benchmarking against the sector, benchmarking against your region. It's a mammoth task to be able to articulate that accordingly. There's also the question of what data sources do you actually use? You guys are waiting, probably be too late now for the next OFS round of APP data, but on top of that, how much internal data do you use? How much sector data do you use? If we're considering intersectionality, so different shared characteristics, how do we look and examine at the sheer number of different combinations meaningfully, and to try and then identify those at risk? What techniques do we employ? How do we do this? When we started off in wave one, there was no template, there was no real sort of method to the madness. And then more importantly for the APP, it's about translating all of that above into a meaningful narrative with possibly only a handful of targets and associated intervention strategies. Briefly, just to show you our timeline, we started this late March, just before Easter was obviously in April last year. We had the OFS sessions, we had the publication of RA6. We only had 2 months really to get this around. And then you will all know yourselves, sort of working through the different committees all the way through. Cool. Up until the 17th of July, when we then submitted our APP. So we knew it must be akin to how
Christian, so apologies, I think you've gone on to mute.
Oh, how bizarre. There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So we knew that the method must be akin to how the OFS were examining this. They too will look at this themselves. We knew as we were approaching it, it must consider for our own institution of the sector, individual rates for each characteristic, so IMD Q1 students, the year-on-year change, the splits, the gaps, the ratios, and all the student characteristics which we've all seen and used within the OFS data dashboard, what they will view as perhaps most important student characteristics. But it's also important to thoroughly examine the intersectionality. As we've said, we need to identify the specific populations at risk if we're able to make any meaningful change. And so even within that, then you're considering differences in aggregated rates, the temporal change. It's a lot of data. And so what we try to do is to manage all this appropriately and build a narrative at varying levels of granulation, which highlighted specific populations which we deem to be most at risk. But, I've already mentioned the challenge. It's about the art of the possible. It's about developing ETL strategies which allow us to meaningfully engage with the output. It's about building a convincing and robust testimony of what we deem to be the most pressing. You'll probably get the OFS coming back to you saying, well, why did you not consider this characteristic or that characteristic, for example? It was about optimizing the use of the OFS resources for sheer reproducibility and replicability purposes. It had to be statistically robust and analytically coherent. It had to include a thorough examination of the confidence intervals as well, so you can understand the range of students potentially at risk. And going forward, we wanted to build something which was a template for future iterations of this exercise. We know that the categories for the EOR might change. We know the student characteristics might change, but if we can build a template for understanding students at risk, we can take that forward into our next APP. So we used the OFS data dashboard, or the SLO website. You will all know that data dashboard. We use the aggregated and individualized data sources. We use our own internal student data, so we have a banner system. And fortunately for us at Southampton, we're quite far down the Power BI journey. So we have a number of dashboards which we could rely on to support our insight that we were generating using the OFS data. Specifically, we have one called the Outcomes Data Explorer, which we were able to place the APP data into quite quickly and make all the different iterations that we saw fit. This had the added benefit of not having to use the slow OFS website version as much as necessary. But we also used our dashboards from the Financial Evaluation Toolkit, some of you might be familiar with, in our own end-of-cycle admissions reports. In the ideal world, we would have used more resources. We would have considered the student experience from the NSS perspective. We would have looked more into graduate outcomes. But again, because of those time constraints, we just didn't get to that. So you can see sort of the idea about what these dashboards looked like. The OFS Outcomes Data Explorer is our key one that we've used for TEF and B3 previously. As soon as we were able to receive the data from the APP, from the OFS, that individualized data, we were able to slot it into place and have a look at the different stages and the intersectionality quite quickly. It was a great benefit to have this, and a shout out to Marty Cronier for developing this one. It's one of our most widely used resources in uni now. But we also have the financial evaluation toolkit dashboard, which we've already mentioned. So we were able to see whether increasing amounts of bursary were actually making meaningful change. And we have our own admissions data, which was able to then supplement and understand that relationship between applications to offers to acceptances, and that sort of leaky funnel of the student population. Because we had those resources at hand, we had a quick way of looking at those insights. It was tabular, it was modular, it worked, it was quicker than the OFS data dashboard. It had the additional strength that because we were using specific University of Southampton characteristics, we have an additional definition for care leavers, for example. We were able to look at those quite quickly as well, rather than having to reference the individualized data against a separate data model. And these tools were really important in sort of providing a quick synopsis of what was going on. We were able to take that data and within a week or two, quite quickly highlight it to the rest of the APP organising committee, sort of where we think we should be going with it. Now, many of you will be aware that Power BI has its limited statistical capabilities. You can't really make meaningful analytics in that sense. There's difficulties in exporting the data sets out if they're of a certain size. It's difficult to consider multiple intersectionalities and to export them quite quickly. And we had slight differences in our outcomes data explorer with the OFS dashboard because it was developed for TEF and B3, so we didn't even have access in there. So we took the main student characteristics that the OFS were discussing in the dashboard. We took our additional tool, which we were interested in also seeing because it was going to be part of our narrative that we were going to consider EPQ, something that we've been really pushing for in widening participation here. And in essence, we updated the Power BI dashboard. We went through every single population characteristic for every single outcome. At this point, we just generated quick tables to understand what was going on. We compared our aggregates against the sector. We compared the splits and the aggregates against the sector. And that allowed us to then generate quite quickly a narrative of where we differ in terms of underperformance against the sector, using the financial evaluation toolkit to support whether those rates were improving, and using the end of cycle report, those application data, to talk about that conversion. What it doesn't do at this point, though, is it doesn't consider the intersectionality, because you'd have hundreds and hundreds of tables, or 2,200 different splits you could look at in terms of intersectionality. And it doesn't consider the sort of the population size. It doesn't consider that intersectionality to that degree that we want. But as a starter for 10, this was a useful point of call. Now, many of the more hardcore data people here might have troubles in replicating the same confidence intervals that the OFS were using. We had that trouble when we were doing it in Power BI. So we produced our own confidence intervals, Wilson scores, to look at that discrepancy in the progression rates, continuation rates. We visualized the short-term change and the long-term change, so year-on-year change versus 6-year change, 3-year change. And where we really went to town on this was that we exported every single intersectionality out of Power BI and every single outcome, aggregated it. And my background, I'm an academic of archaeological data science, so I was able to take that data out and produce row-wise regression models for each intersection, for each outcome, which meant you could look at the slope data to prioritize those that were going down, that weren't doing what we wanted. But we could use the p-values to then identify those that were significantly decreasing year on year, those that were definitely going to be what we could count as at risk. And you can see on the right here just the exemplification of those Wilson score intervals on our progression rates for each of the different intersections. So you can see sort of the wider confidence intervals, less reliable because obviously a smaller sample size, but you can start to understand the main population characteristics, which are at the lower end of these rates. Just on a technical note, the Jeffreys interval for the OFS would have been ideal because it obviously considers 0 to 100% a lot smoother. We couldn't do that at that point. I don't think I could still do it in Power BI. I don't think we're there with that. But I put the DAX in for anyone who's also trying to build their own intervals as well. What we were able to then do with all of this data, as I said, is that long-term year-on-year and year-on-year change and the row-wise regression models. You can see on the left, we've got 4 quadrants, the top right being where they've improved year-on-year and long-term. Bottom left, those that didn't improve year-on-year and those that didn't improve over long-term. We were able to use these 2 methods to build up quite a convincing testimony of those populations at risk. For example, on the right, you can see the blue dots represent those significantly different. And we can pull out a population like male and eligible for FSM. We see that they are the most significant downtrend. We know they've not progressed year on year. We know they've not progressed over the 3 years of progression. And when we look at that data, we can see how bad it is quite quickly. Now, this would be quite difficult to do if you had all 2,200 rows of different percentages for all the different years. So this was quite a robust way of examining that risk. For those who are interested in how we did that, I've also included the R code so you can have a go at doing your own row-wise regression models with that data. Altogether then, some of you might actually have downloaded the PDF. It's a convincing and good read, I'd like to think. 17,000 words, 42 pages, 12 student characteristics examined, 2,000 plus intersectionalities considered. And this provided a nice framework for them moving on to target setting. Just to quickly note, we thought it was thorough, future-proof. It was a robust framework to tackle significant amount of data at speed. We were able to double check throughout, so we knew and we had the trust in our data. The pluralism of the student characteristics was considered, which was really satisfactory because then we could go into specific intervention strategies and know who to target. And the document in conjunction with our dashboards allows more focused strategies, which I've just mentioned. So where we could have been better was linking it to the EORR indicators of risk from an analytical perspective. As I said, we could have looked at student experience, the NSS results, on-course attainment. We could have looked at the more internal sources, so extenuating circumstances, uptake of welfare support. But within the space of 2.5 months, it was just about the art of the possible. To think about how we then generate targets, and I know there might be a fair few of you at this stage at the moment, how do you generate a meaningful target or a realistic target? We decided to focus on our specific region when we were doing our targets, given our sort of socioeconomic geography, being on the south coast, where our students would typically come from, a bit more affluent perhaps, and also our status as a Russell group. But our head of WP, Gino Graziano, he wanted to ensure that for access-related targets, we were exemplar for egalitarianism in our region. So what we did then is we took all of the different institutions in our region. We looked at the different targets that we pulled out, so male FSM for progression. And we started to look at how our scores fed to theirs and aim for a meaningful top 3, be in the top third of those lists. So as an example, then PTA 1, which was our first target to increase the proportion of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, IMD Q1. Our entry rate is a stubborn 7%. 10.4% would result in us being in the top third. That means we'd have 3.4 percentage points over the course of the APP. First year is always a bit slow because obviously you're testing it, you're getting into place. So we were quite modest in having a 0.4 percentage point rise in the first year and a percentage point every year afterwards. All in all, then, we felt that the rationale laid out for our document, the analytical robustness, the specifics of the intersectionalities, and our target setting was fair, thorough, and worked through all of that the OFS had set. In hindsight, and this has just been while I've been making this PowerPoint, I feel we could have gone further with our target setting. It was fair given the time restraints and the capacity. But what we should have done is modeled the trajectories over the next 4 or 5 years and generate a new third number from that. Because obviously they're not static entities, these rates. They're going to change as people change their strategies. And in this example, if you do model that, if you do more regression models to see where they are in 27, 28, our IMD Q1 target would be 13.3 instead of 10%. It's a bit late to change that now, but that is one thing I would really encourage people to consider when making their targets, is not how are other institutions performing now, but how will they be performing in 3 or 4 years. So that's all from me. I hope you found it useful. There is, as I say, code in the appendix. There is sort of little tidbits that you can use throughout. If you have any questions after this session, please,